Hi, everybody. Can people hear me? If you can hear me, just say, let me know in the chat box, just so I know that everything's working. Hi there, can people hear me? Great, thank you very much. Okay, we'll get started in a few minutes. It's not quite 11 Eastern time yet, so we'll get started then, but thank you. Hello, everybody. Let's go ahead and get started. But before we do, just a couple things. We have Brittany on with us, who is our support person. She can answer any like non-content related questions. She's also posting links, for where you can schedule a consultation. If you're interested in that, it's free. Also, where you can find this webinar and others, they are archived on our website. So you can access those there. Also, if you have questions as we go along, that's fine. You might want to jot them down, or you can even type them in the chat or the question and answer box as we go along. So you remember them, but I won't get to them until the end. Okay, good. So let's get going. So welcome to the webinar, the Statistics Solutions webinar on Chapter 1 of the Social Sciences dissertation. We follow, well, basically we help you with whatever structure your school follows. But, typically a typical structure is the 5-chapter model, with chapter 1 being the introduction, chapter 2 being the literature review, chapter 3 being the methodology, chapter 4 being the results, and chapter 5 being the discussion. Okay, so the first thing I'm going to say, and you're going to hear me repeat it several times throughout the presentation, is always obtain your school's template or guidelines for the chapters. While there are a lot of commonalities and a lot of typical and expected structures and sections that are similar throughout, your school may have particular guidelines or particular things they want to see. So it's always helpful to obtain again your school's particular template or guidelines to see what they require specifically. Okay. Right, so chapter 1, the introduction, it's the introduction to the dissertation. So I like to kind of pull back a little bit and give a big picture of the dissertation before we start, so we can kind of see the forest before we kind of get lost in the trees. But chapter 1 is like a blueprint to your dissertation, right? It's going to tell your reader, it's going to answer the big 3 questions: what, how, why, and how. So what are you doing? What's your topic? Why are you doing it? What's the need for your study? What's the research problem? What's driving the study? And how, which is the methods, right? How are you going to conduct your study? How are you going to collect data? Of course, you're going to talk about that more in chapter 3, the how part. But it kind of introduces what you're going to be doing as far as that. Okay. So again, kind of acts like a blueprint for the study. And these are the typical sections of chapter 1. Again, get your template, see what may be similar or a little different. The introduction, the background, research problem, purpose, theoretical framework, definition, significance. Other sections, I've kind of lumped a few in here because they're kind of small, and some schools have them, some schools don't, in a summary. Okay, so the introduction to the introduction, sorry. Okay. So in the introduction, I mean, obviously you're going to introduce the topic of your study. This would include any organizational or the organizational or the social problem that your study is designed to address. Right, this social or organizational problem can be something like, if it's education, it might be declining test scores of students in a certain area or on certain tests. it could be the kind of attrition of a certain kind of teachers, maybe a special education teachers. If it's, in business, it could be some kind of business problem or the attrition of a specific kind of worker. So there's some kind of organizational or social problem. Use statistics or kind of a recent peer-reviewed source that highlights the problem. If you use statistics, make them as recent as possible, right? Because if you use statistics from 10, 15 years ago, the numbers have changed, undoubtedly. The problem may have changed, right? It may be less of a problem. So even a supported observation should be recent, because you want to show that the problem is a recent problem, is a problem now. So use some kind of statistics, numbers, or again, a supported observation, citation, to put the topic on the table to get the reader's attention. Then also introduce the research problem. So we have the organizational problem, and the research problem is there has been research on the topic, or maybe there's not yet, which is a kind of research problem. So based on the problem that exists, the organizational or social problem, what research has been done on it, right? And the research problem is what still we need to understand the problem better. If the problem is still a problem, research has been conducted on it, but there's still information we may need, or a different type of approach. So that's what a research problem is, and we'll get more to that in a minute. So introduce the research problem. In other words, the research that is designed to get the information you need to address the organizational problem. What is the issue in the research or the gap? Why is the study needed? You want to include those things in the introduction. Obviously, you're going to flesh a lot of this stuff out later, but you want to introduce it here. So when you get, when your reader gets to the end of this section, they should know what you're doing and why. State how your study is designed to address the research problem, and you can end with a preview of the sections of the chapter if you want. So introduce the organizational or social problem, introduce the research problem, state why the study is needed. And again, you can end kind of preview sections of the chapter if you want to. This kind of moves into the background. And the background is material, somewhat historical, it has to be. Where the problem has been, right? And where the research on the problem has been also. So it's not just out, kind of tracing the problem to the present day. It's also tracing research on the problem, because that's going to lead into the next section, which is getting microphone noise. Okay, I'm not sure what that is about. How about, hold on. How about now? Is this better? Yes, there's some feedback. I'm not sure what that is. Okay, it's a little better. Okay, all right, great. Okay. Yeah, sometimes it's just a connection. All right, good. Okay, the background. Again, it's going to lead to your research problem, which is the next section, but it's just like it sounds. It's background on the problem or the topic, kind of where it's been. You're focusing on major trends in the issue and in the research too, right? So it's kind of a background, not only on the topic or the problem, but on research on the problem, right? So trends, what have people been focusing on? What has worked, what hasn't worked? So give the reader an overview or a background on the topic and the research on the topic. Like I said, this is going to include some historical material. Again, focus on trends. right? You don't need to get hyper specific at this point. You can do that in the lit review later. And so it kind of funnels down and it ends to where the problem is now and where the research on the problem is now. And should end with the gap or the need for your study, right? Where the research is now, what's in the research, and kind of what's missing from the research or what's still needed, which should transition right into your research problem. So it's a more targeted kind of overview of the recent research on your topic, and it highlights the research problem. You want to specifically state what the research problem is. You want to also specifically state that your study is designed to address the research problem. But what is the research problem, right? People sometimes have kind of a little, they kind of understand it, or they think they do, but they don't really have a good grasp of it, and that's fine. It's just like it sounds. It's a problem in the research. Now, what does that mean? It means there may be a gap in the research or our understanding of the topic. And a gap is a kind of research problem, but a research problem doesn't always have to be a gap. A research problem can be that a certain topic or problem has been approached from a certain point of view, largely, or using a certain approach. So maybe most research on this topic is quantitative, and we need to understand it more comprehensively and more in depth. So a qualitative approach is needed. It could be that research on the topic has largely included certain populations and has excluded, including other populations. So those are just kind of some general examples of research problems. Or again, it can be a gap, like there's not much research on this topic right now. We need more. That's a kind of research problem too. And the research problem is, it stems from the research. In other words, or more precisely, what's not in the research. Okay, what's still needed to kind of address the topic, and that's where your study is going to come in. And so when you're putting together the research problem, and here's another good thing to remember, is just, it's always helpful to get an example of an approved dissertation from your school in your area, maybe from your chair, or you can go to ProQuest through your university library, because attending webinars is great, using your resources is great, going online, studying as much as you can these sections, but sometimes just seeing an actual sample when you sit down to write is really helpful. Okay, the purpose. Next is the purpose section, and it's not usually really long, but your purpose statement should begin the purpose section, and the purpose statement is very specific. It has very kind of specific wording that they usually want, and it's something like I have written out here. There's an example from a quantitative study and an example for a qualitative study. But it should include the purpose of this, and it should include your approach and then your design. So for example, the purpose of this quantitative correlational study is to examine. The verbs are not so important, but examine, investigate is usually associated with quantitative research. Explore is usually better for qualitative research. The purpose of this quantitative correlational study is to examine, and then it's going to be exactly what you're examining, your variables, your concepts, right? Whatever it is you're doing. The relationship between transformational leadership and emotional intelligence then you're going to have your sample and setting, whatever that is, the specifics of that. So there's a very specific kind of construction for the problem statement, which you can kind of use this as a template and then just plug in your specific details into those areas. And the other thing to know about the problems, I'm sorry, not the problem statement, the purpose statement. Did I say problem statement before? Purpose statement. Is that when you mention your purpose anywhere else in the study, you should mention it verbatim. So in other words, and there's only two places you got to pass on that. That's the purpose statement and that's the research questions. So anytime you mention those two things anywhere else in the study, they should appear verbatim. Now you can't do that with anything else. So I see sometimes people try to move content, you know, from the lit review to somewhere else, and it's like you can't just copy and paste stuff. Professors really frown on that. However, again, the purpose statement you can, and you're expected to, in the research questions the same. So yeah, the purpose statement has a very specific construction. The other information in the purpose section, it may include specific information about your variables. You know, such and such variable will be your independent variable, such and such variable will be your dependent variable. You may talk a little bit about your major concepts or the instruments you will be using. And again, you don't go into this information, that comes later in methods, but you just mention it. So that information can all go in the purpose section, and usually it's not very long, you know, maybe a paragraph. And again, check your school's templates for any kind of specific expectations they have. Okay, that's the purpose section. All right, the research questions. This isn't a methods related webinar, so we're not going to go into any kind of depth about how to develop research questions, but those are covered in some of our methods seminar webinars. So check those out if you're really interested in how to develop your research questions. But usually the research questions come next. And generally the research questions are designed to collect the information that you're looking for, the information to address the research problem. Okay, the theoretical framework. This seems to be challenging for folks. Kind of understanding what it is and its purpose, and you know, just kind of how it fits into the study. So I mean, generally and basically, your theoretical framework or your theory or your conceptual framework, it's kind of a theoretical grounding or foundation for your study. It helps kind of guide your study. It also helps you to explain the results later in chapter 5. Theoretical framework or conceptual framework, that's a big question. Without getting too deeply into it, I've found that theoretical frameworks are typically associated with quantitative studies. Conceptual frameworks are typically associated with qualitative studies. The reason for that is usually quantitative studies, you're using instruments to measure constructs, and those instruments have theoretical foundations. So in other words, if say you're studying emotional intelligence, you're using an instrument to measure emotional intelligence. Well, that instrument will have a theoretical foundation. All instruments do. They don't develop them from nothing. They develop them from theories. So that kind of makes it easy for a quantitative study. You know, your constructs, you're studying emotional intelligence and transformational leadership. Well, those are your two theories that will constitute your theoretical framework right there. Now, that what you want to be careful to do is, if you're using, say, Goldman's instrument to measure emotional intelligence, there are several instruments. You want to make sure that your instrument and its theoretical foundation match. Okay, so if you're using Goldman's instrument, you don't want to use somebody else's theoretical foundation for your theoretical framework, right? You want to use Goldman's theoretical foundation. All right, you see how that needs to align? So the researchers who developed the instruments, usually have their own kind of theoretical foundation that they've based it on. So you want to make sure that aligns. So in other words, you don't want to use somebody's instrument and use somebody else's theory. You want to use the researchers that aligns with the theory that the researcher's theory that aligns with the instrument. Okay. For a conceptual framework, usually qualitative studies are a little more exploratory, like we don't have information on something, we want to explore, see what's out there. In that case, you would use kind of major concepts associated with what you're looking at to kind of put together your theoretical framework, if it's, or conceptual framework, if it's qualitative and conceptual. So you would basically kind of define those concepts and talk about how they relate to your study and how they relate to what you're looking for. And a conceptual framework and a qualitative study also helps to guide your interview questions, because you just can't base them on nothing. So your conceptual framework helps to guide your interview questions. So how should you set this section up? I mean, basically, you know, first sentence come out and say so-and-so's theory or such and such theory will serve as the theoretical or conceptual framework for the study. Obviously, use citations, define the theory, define any components of the theory that you'll be using. For example, transformational leadership, it has components. And usually if you're measuring transformational leadership, you're measuring those components. So include the components, include definitions of the components, talk a little bit about who developed it, why they developed it. You know, theories are developed to explain things. So talk a little bit about why the researcher developed the theory to explain what. Talk a little bit about what researchers have used the theory for and how the theory connects to your study, how it relates or supports what you're doing, and how it's going to, you know, help explain and guide your study. A really good section, again, to look at examples, because again, it's easier to kind of sometimes, even though you think you may understand it, once you sit down to write it, things get a little hazy. So sometimes it's helpful to look at a sample. Okay, nature of the study or study design. Again, look at your template for your school. Some schools, this section doesn't appear in chapter 1. Some schools it does. Obviously, you're going to have a whole chapter on your study design and your study methods. But if it appears, this section appears in chapter 1, it's kind of a preview of that or an overview of that. So which usually includes a rationale for the selection of your design. Kind of an overview of a summary of the methodology, you know, who you're going to collect data from, how you're going to collect data, how your data will be analyzed. And again, we do have chapter 3 webinars and methodology webinars. So if you're more, you know, if you need more information on that, I encourage you to attend one of those. All right, definitions. These are, this is a section on the definitions of the terms that you'll be using specific to your study. And there's no real surprises here, right? Because these are going to be things like your variables, factors, major ideas that are associated with your study. And this section, other than the definitions, really doesn't need any content. I mean, if you want to introduce it, you can use a simple sentence, something like the following terms are defined for use in this study, period, and then just get into your definitions. Sometimes people like to overdo these definitions, and I emphasize that they're definitions, they're not discussions. You know, sometimes I see people say, well, Smith defines emotional intelligence like this. However, Jones defines it this way. There's a lot of inconsistencies about the way that this term is defined. Again, it's not a discussion, right? You want the definition of how you'll be using whatever it is in your study. So emotional intelligence will refer to, or emotional intelligence refers to, and just have the definition of it. So usually you can get away with one sentence, maybe two, but there's really no reason to go on past that. Definition should be in the form of sentences. They should be clear and succinct. So in other words, like I said, succinct, you know, to the point. A sentence, like I said, maybe two. They definitely all need to be supported with peer-reviewed sources or a peer-reviewed source. Absolutely no dictionary definitions, because they are not general definitions. There are definitions specific to the research and specific to your study. So they need to come from the research. And they should be recent when possible. This is not so important here as it is through the rest of the document, because sometimes definitions come from theories and sometimes theories are older. Okay. Significance. Sometimes this is called implications. And professors like to call this the so what section. Like, so you're doing this study. So what? Right? What can it tell us? What's the upshot? How can it contribute to research? How can it contribute to what we do in practice? So what is the significance of your results? What are the implications of your results? Obviously, you don't know now because you haven't conducted your study yet. So this is kind of forward looking in the sense of how your results may be significant, what implications your results might have. And this section is really two-pronged. So one prong is about research and theory, and one prong is about practice. So, you know, looking ahead, how might your findings, information collected from your study, contribute to the research or the theory? So, you know, it might add a certain understanding to the research because it's a different approach than a lot of the theories on it. I mean, a lot of the studies on the topic, or it includes a different population, which could change, modify your understanding or contribute to the literature that way. Practice, practically, how is going to be significant to practice? And that's just like it sounds. How might the information that you collect from your study, how could it inform what people do at the level of practice in the area that you're studying? You know, if it's teachers, if it's an educational study, how might information help teachers, inform what teachers do? Maybe administrators, maybe you could you know, give administrators information they need to make decisions, administrative decisions. So, you know, whom does it concern and how? And you can kind of get nuts and bolts at the practical significance. You know, it might inform kind of professional development efforts, or, you know, the information could be disseminated through, you know, workshops or training, things like that. And here are the other sections that I've kind of squished together. Some schools have them, some schools don't, some schools have some of them. Limitations. Limitations are weaknesses or shortcomings that may affect your results. And of course, you're not going to know what's going to be a limitation. But again, it's kind of forward looking, what could be possible limitations of your study. You know, sometimes people have a hard time getting the actual population of the sample they want or they need. Qualitative studies, limitations can always include researcher bias, you know, if you're too close to the study or too close to the topic. And there's ways to kind of prevent and mitigate researcher bias that you should probably discuss if you think that could be a limitation. And they're not just challenges. They're not just like, oh, it might be hard to do this. It's actually something that could affect your results. Assumptions, kind of tricky, but what these are, they're things that you don't have control over, so you have to assume them. And the big one is that you can't control what people will say or how they will answer surveys, right? So you just have to assume as a researcher that they're going to be honest and straightforward with you. Scope, also called delimitations. Some people tend, because delimitations has the word limitations in it, sometimes people confuse the limitations and delimitations, but really think of it as scope, like the scope of your study. So what does your study contain? What does it exclude? And your delimitations are things that you're delimiting. You're placing delimitations on your study, right? You're going to include only teachers in your study, not administrators, not students, just teachers for a certain reason. So that's the scope of your study, or the boundaries. If you that helps you to think of the boundaries of your study, what it includes, what it doesn't include, and usually it kind of follows pretty close to the purpose. Here's what I'm going to include and why. Here's what I'm not including, and it helps sometimes when something, again, like education studies, you're only studying teachers, not students, not administrators. And again, these little sections they're usually pretty brief, paragraph maybe, but again, look at samples because they can be a little tricky. And here we are at the summary. And I'm going to go back to the research problem in a minute because I realized now I forgot to include something. So the summary, it's just like other summaries, right? You recap major points of the chapter. It's helpful to remind the reader of the research problem and why your study is needed. And you can end by transitioning to the next chapter if you want. But again, just see what your template calls for. It may have specific expectations. But avoid the fake summary, what I call the fake summary. I don't know, sometimes folks just, I don't know what it is. They may just kind of like, it's a summary. I'm going to phone it in. I did this, this, and this. And they just kind of list the sections. That's not a real summary. Again, just recap the major points, remind the reader of why your study is needed. Here's our information. I'm going to go back to the research problem in a minute. I'm going to leave this up. We're a consulting, editing service. We do editing and we do consulting and we do guidance. And the editing we do is just not line editing. It's what we call developmental editing, to help you develop the chapter or chapters into what they need to be approved. So a lot of it is, guidance as well as the actual line editing. Okay, you can have a consultation, see if what we offer is right for you. It's free. There's our contact information, phone number. Okay, the research problem. What I wanted to emphasize, and I kind of forgot. We'll go back here. Say your research problem is a gap. And again, a gap is a kind of research problem. They're not always gaps. How do you describe a gap? Yeah, it's tough because a gap by definition is the absence of something. So if your research problem is gap, how do you describe the gap when it's by definition not there? And this is what I took from another researcher, and it's helped me, and I'm going to pass it along. They said, think of a donut hole, a donut. It makes me hungry, but other than that, what's the point? Well, if you're trying to describe the donut hole, you can't really, because it's nothing there. So what you do is you describe the donut around it. And the donut, it's a metaphor for, the donut is the research that exists around your topic or around the gap. right? So here's all the research that's been conducted on my area, my topic, specifically what I'm doing. But as you can see, it all gets close to what I'm trying to get to, but it's not there. So it frames the gap. So you can describe the frame of the gap, which in turn highlights the gap. I hope that makes sense. Okay, I'm going to go back to our contact information. Whoops. And if you have any questions, please type them in the chat box or the question and answer box, either one, and see if I can answer them. Okay, that's that. Why am I out of? Any questions? The recording of this will come via email, correct? That I'm not sure of, but I do know that Brittany did post links for our website, and they are on our website. They're archived on our websites. So they're easy enough to just go to our website, click on the link, and there they are. Okay, great. Anybody else? Questions related to content? Okay, there you go. Thank you, Brittany. Do you help international students? Yes, we do, and we have in the past. What are some of the typical pitfalls that you have seen most researchers fall into in this chapter? Some of them I kind of mentioned as we went along. The research problem can be tricky sometimes. Sometimes people like to base research problems on their observations or on their experiences. And the research problem has to be grounded or framed by the literature that exists. Now, if you have an observation or you're a practitioner and you see something on a daily basis, or, or you're really drawn to something because you like it, that's fine, as long as you can support it with research. So I'd say one of the challenges can be the research problem. Another challenge is the big one is the theoretical framework. Probably those are the two biggest that I see in this chapter. Okay, let's see. How do you address credibility and trustworthiness? I'm not the greatest person to answer that, because those are methods question, but we do have a webinar on qualitative methods, and that would fall under that. So I would encourage you to attend that, or to go to one of the webinars that are archived there. But yeah, that's like validity and reliability for isn't quantitative, but credibility and trustworthiness is like that for qualitative studies. And it has to do usually with an audit trail, and just kind of being so meticulous and specific about what you're doing and how you're going to do it, that somebody could go back and kind of replicate it. Can an area field be over-researched? Oh, absolutely. Yeah, I don't know what over-research means, but yeah, college retention is one of them, right? I mean, there's a lot of research on college retention. There was a lot of research on emotional intelligence. And sometimes topics trend, and fade and maybe come back, like emotional intelligence. I don't see that much research on it anymore, but a few years ago, there was a lot of it. Now, over-researched, yeah, I guess you could call it over-researched, but then the issue, the challenge becomes then, if something has so much research in it, sometimes it's hard to develop a research problem, to get a unique angle. In college retention, oh my God, there's so much, how are you going to get a unique angle? So that can be a challenge with topics that have a lot of research on them. Okay, if you're doing quantitative study, where does the actual study go? Or did we discuss that part of the overall thesis? I'm not sure what you mean when you say, where does the actual study go? Are you talking about the methods? If you're talking about the methods, there's a whole chapter on methods. It's usually chapter 3. How do you narrow down an educational topic that is broad or a topic that has limited research or research that is general? I mean, you narrow it down by focusing specifically what it is you want to focus on. And usually that has to do with, your setting, your population. Let's take college retention, right? A big, broad thing. How do you narrow it down? Well, you can narrow it down to, by specific population. Like, are you looking at retention of a specific group, right? Maybe athletes, right? College retention among, athletes or specific group, or you can narrow it by what you're trying to find out, about retention. And look into the research, what have people focused on? What have they kind of left to the side? What haven't they focused on? So those are some kind of ways to narrow it down by either your approach, your study approach, what it is specifically you're looking at, maybe the population, maybe retention as it connects to some other kind of idea or concept. Okay, I don't think international PhDs are accepted. I have already interacted with Brittany and she told me they don't. Okay, then I don't know for sure. I mean, I know we've worked with international students in the past. You can, if you wanted to be, double check, you could make a consultation or send an email to the and just ask to double check. Okay. I'm still reading. Hold on. Counselor preparedness is in the college prep process is my topic. Counselor preparedness in the college prep process is my topic. Okay, I mean, that's a good topic. Yeah, how do you narrow it down? I assuming what you're asking. Go to the literature on counselor preparedness, because I'm sure there is some. See what people have done, see what they focused on, see what the areas that they haven't focused on. You need to define preparedness. You could look at a specific kind of college counselor. Maybe there's again, one's designed for athletic students, athletes, maybe in a specific program in the college. So just, think of ways you can narrow it down, or exactly what you're looking at. Preparedness, is it preparedness at the like on the job, training? Is it when they come out of college, how prepared they are? Does it have to do with the courses they take in grad school or in undergrad? So there's different ways to pare that down. But again, I would go to the literature and see what people have looked at, see the trends in the research. And, at the end of the studies too, they'll also give you ideas, recommendations for further research that are real helpful, Okay, do journals have other requirements apart from what you've discussed that are different? Journals, like publishing in a journal? Yeah, I mean, the components will be the same, but there'll be some things that you need to leave out for a journal. There's some things in dissertations, some of the language. There's a lot of redundancy or repetition in dissertations that you would cut out for a journal. Okay. Will the recording be available? Yeah, it's on our website, and if you scroll on up the chat box, Brittany has posted links to our website, and you can find our webinars archived there. Okay, good. Let me see if I have any more. Okay. Can you repost, Brittany, can you repost that link? And again, I think if you scroll it all the way up to that chat, top of the chat box through there. I think I covered them all. Yep, great. Yep, thank you, Brittany. I think I covered it, everything. Is there anything else? Okay, just want to remind you, we do run webinars on different chapters. I also do a webinar on chapter 2 and chapter 5, the non-method stuff. We also run, this would be other people doing it, webinars on chapters 3 and 4, and also just on different topics. I think there's webinars on specific methods topics. Okay, great. Okay, you're welcome, everybody. Great. Thank you for the great. Thank you. All right. I appreciate the thanks. Okay, you're welcome. All right. All right. Good luck, everybody. I'm going to let you go. And again, show up for other webinars or, make an appointment for a consultation, see if what we offer is right for you. And thank you, Brittany. Will this be posted? Yeah, it's on the website. They're archived. All the webinars are archived on the website. Okay, thanks, everybody. Goodbye.